So welcome to a new session of our webinar on data science and statistics. Today we have the pleasure of welcoming Paula Vicente. She is professor at Department of Quantitative Methods for Management and Economics at ISCTE, Instituto Universitário de Lisboa, where she's a researcher at the Business Research Unit. A dominant topic of interest is survey methodology, and she's been consultant on numerous projects regarding survey design, sampling, questionnaire design, and reporting. Today, Paula will talk to us about a very up-to-date topic on how to sample Twitter users for social science research. Paula, thank you very much for having accepted our invitation. It is a pleasure, and the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I would like to thank Paula Brito and Eduardo Silva for the kind invitation they addressed me to take part in this seminar. The topic I bring to discussion concerns the use of Twitter as a means to conduct social science investigation. We all know that social media is growing in number of users and is increasingly popular, inclusive for academic research. Some even argue that it can replace traditional research modes like surveys. Surveys, a widely used mode of data collection in social science research, is eventually at risk of being relegated to a marginal place. Twitter is a huge universe, both in number of users and amount of data, so using it for research requires, in most cases, resorting to sampling. The challenges of sampling the Twitterverse for social science research is the topic of my presentation. This is the agenda of my presentation. I will start with some statistics describing social media penetration. Then I will present some characteristics of the Twitterverse, revealing who are the members of this online platform and what kind of data it contains. Then I will draw on two methodological issues in Twitter context: coverage error and selectivity bias. The problematic of sampling Twitter users will be discussed at the light of empirical evidence I collected by a systematic review of the literature. And finally, a discussion on the pros and cons of Twitter as a mean for social science research. Since its inception in 1996, social media has managed to infiltrate half of the worldwide population. Social network platforms almost tripled their total user base in the last decade, from 970 million in 2010 to approaching 4.5 billion users in 2021. 57% of the world population is active on social media when we look at the eligible audiences of social media. Only people aged 13 or over can be social media users. Moreover, 99% of social media users access social media websites or apps through a mobile device, which means that using social media is something people can do anytime, anywhere. Looking now at social media penetration, computed as the number of active users versus the total population, the most active country is the United Arab Emirates with 99 of its population using social media. Quite different from India, in which only 1/3 of the population uses social media. In the European Union, Malta leads with the penetration rates of social media with 91% of users, while Germany is in the bottom of the table with 45% of active users. In January 2022, recent data, Facebook is the leading social network with 2.9 billion users worldwide. YouTube and WhatsApp following with over 2 billion, and Twitter has about 400 million users. In Portugal, Twitter has only 1.4 million users, much behind Facebook or YouTube with more than 5 million users each. So it is worth to pay attention to what people post in social media platforms. Probably yes. These figures I am presenting are from a survey of more than 2,000 consumers conducted by a private company. And according to this survey, only 19% of consumers find brand-created content to be authentic. The majority of respondents indicated that user-generated content resonates as more authentic, with nearly 80% saying that user-generated content highly impacts their purchasing decisions. Furthermore, 80% said they would be more likely to purchase a product from an online store if its website had photos or videos from real customers. Important enough that 64% of the Generation Z and 60% of the millennials indicate that they have left an e-commerce store without purchasing anything because the site didn't include customer photos or reviews. This means that companies and business cannot ignore what people post and share on social media if they want to meet customers' expectation. This is surely an argument in favor of social media as a data or an information source. In the academic domain, we also find signs of increased relevance of social media. A quick search on the core collection of Web of Science, if we search for the word Twitter or Facebook or Instagram in title, we find that for the case of Twitter, until now, 2022, more than 9,000 papers were published. I recall that Twitter was launched in 2006. The early papers came mostly from the areas of computational science and engineering, and despite its maintained relevance, other areas are emerging, such as communication, information science, social science, and political science. So, what is Twitter? Probably all of you have some idea of it is Twitter, especially if you are a Twitter user. So I will give only a few details of this universe. Twitter is a real-time social networking and information service on which users share character-limited messages on their personalized half-public news feed. The length of these messages, the so-called tweets, was originally restricted to 140 characters, but in November 2017 was doubled to the current 280. While in the early days of Twitter, the exchange of information was the main focus of this online network, further features for social interactions have been developed since. It is now possible to retweet, reply to tweets, like tweets, share pictures, links, and other multimedia data, as well as to send private messages to single individuals or groups. Using hash signs before words is a popular mechanism to tag tweets with that specific word, turning them into hashtags. Hashtags are linked and can be searched for. Presently, Twitter is being used in various ways, for example, to interact with potential voters by political institutions, to advertise new products by companies, or as a channel of communication between people to share a common topic of interest, both in everyday lives or during political crises or events occurrence. Every day, approximately 500 million tweets are sent worldwide. One of the key features of Twitter that makes it different from other social networks is that most of the content on Twitter is publicly accessible via the Twitter APIs or through resellers such as GNIP, whereas most content of other social media platforms is private. Thus, Twitter has emerged as the single most powerful big data source available to social scientists for collecting fine-grained, time-stamped data of interaction for local, regional, and global events, in addition to user level. API stands for the Application Programming Interface and is a set of programming code that enables data transmission between one software product and another. Twitter offers three types of APIs, or at least these three I'm going to mention are the most well-known. Three APIs together: Twitter data, the Firehose API, the REST API, and the Stream API. Each of these has different procedures to extract specific data. The Firehose API allows full access to Twitter data without any limitation. The Firehose API provides 100% of Twitter data in real time. Despite the suitability of this method for research, Firehose is not generally used due to its high monetary costs. In addition, Firehose is not available directly. It is not public per se, only through third-party companies licensed by Twitter, such as GNIP I have mentioned, can researchers have access to the Firehose API. The other two APIs are public and easy to access. The REST API allows to extract tweets containing specific keywords or hashtags, geographical boundaries, user IDs, allows reading author profiles and followers data, extracting settings, etc. However, contains some limitations. The search request can only go back in time 1 week, and it only returns at most 1% of all the tweets produced on Twitter at a given time. The Streaming API only sends out real-time tweets. After sending a certain request to the API, specific data will be sent to the user continuously. This API needs a search term to filter the results, such as a hashtag, a specific user ID, or a geographical area defined by coordinates. Like the REST API, it provides data up to 1% of the capacity of the Firehose. Twitter is, in summary, a huge database available with numerous possibilities for research. The footprints left by its users while interacting with each other can be collected and analyzed. As an example of its richness for data mining, the metadata in each tweet contains not only the text, but also several different variables, such as the number of followers, the favorites, the language of the tweets, the geographic location of the user when the tweet was posted, etc. In this slide, there are some examples of the metadata that can be retrieved together with the content of the tweets. Another issue that is relevant to consider is that different objects or statistical units can be observed in Twitter data, leading to three distinct populations. The population of tweets, which also includes retweets, but it's important to note that only public posts are available. Those users who have a private profile, we cannot access the contents of their accounts. The population of Twitter accounts, which includes private accounts, professional, organization accounts, and fake accounts, those accounts that are simulated by bots or spammers, and the population of Twitter users. Important to mention that one user may have several accounts, and an account may have several users. So after this brief description of the Twitterverse, I will address now one methodological issue about Twitter data, specifically coverage error. This figure shows the relationship between the target population that we might define for our study and the populations observed on Twitter. We can distinguish between the internet population, those with access to the internet, the population with social media, and the Twitter population. Finally, depending on the data collection method, we get an observed sample. The crucial part is to determine the target variable, which is often a non-observed variable, and then we get what is represented here as the dark gray part in the figure. The Twitter account population suffers from both overcoverage and undercoverage. The problem of overcoverage is caused by accounts that are associated with companies or organizations, or are used to generate spam. Of course, if the target population of our studies is made of persons, users, accounts that are related to companies or organizations are out of the scope of our study. There is an estimate that about 7% of Twitter accounts are used to produce spam or to automatically generate tweets. Of course, this is content that usually is not relevant for us. Moreover, there are accounts associated with private companies, newspapers, or other entities that should not be associated with the target population. Another methodological issue with Twitter data is selectivity bias. In this figure, we can identify three phases, three stages in the self-selection process present in Twitter data. The first one is connected to the coverage error, in particular, the propensity to have access to the internet. The second one is associated with the use of social media in general. and in particular with having a Twitter account. And it is not just a question of the percentage of users and non-users. The use of online social media is dependent on the socioeconomic background of the individuals, making the sample of users of social media and also those of Twitter unbalanced. The third phase relates to the activity of posting tweets, as data are captured only when individuals tweet. Once people are online, they behave in a variety of ways. The nature of social media data is such that the production of information online is almost never distributed equally across individuals. Some people post far more information than the average user, and other individuals rarely, if ever, generate their own content. Individuals who never post information may be invisible to certain sampling techniques and might be systematically undersampled. This process, of course, can bias the results of data collection towards the heaviest users. Let us look at some statistics about these issues. According to information I retrieved from 2 sites that monitor online activity, in Portugal in 2021, internet access was available for 85% of the adult population. 84% of those with internet access use social media, good values of coverage, but Twitter only covers 5% of social media users. I have to say that there is no consensus about these values. If we consult eventually other information sources, we may find some differences regarding these values, but in the essence, the idea is more or less this one I am giving to you. In this slide, we see that a Twitter sample is likely to be unbalanced in demographic features. Several studies point that Twitter users tend to be younger than the general population. Some studies point to gender differences, male prevailing, and the predominance of the more highly educated and wealthier people than the general offline population. But for example, in Portugal, this kind of profile that I retrieved from one of the Eurobarometer studies, for example, does not reveal a significant difference in terms of the education. So there are differences between countries in terms of this kind of profile, and even across different social network platforms, the profile of the users is not equal, not the same. Additionally, there is the usage pattern of Twitter. According to a survey of the Pew Research Center, most Twitter users access the platform only a few times a week or less, and a minority of extremely active tweeters produce the majority of all tweets. The top 25% of users, the top here is measured by tweet volume, produces 97% of all tweets. Also important to note that those 25% of users do not produce original tweets. 80% of tweets from this group are either direct retweets or replies to other tweets. Replies and retweets is also what less active tweeters tend to do. In resume, these figures give us a picture of the challenges of representativeness facing social science research conducted in the Twitterverse, especially when the purpose is generalizing conclusions to the offline population. Now, why sampling? Social science research conducted under traditional modes is based, in most cases, in samples of the target population. Surveys is the most popular method for quantitative research in social sciences and involves sampling. In Twitter, this is not different. Twitter is a huge universe, despite its coverage problems. Sampling to study this universe is, in most cases, inevitable. Either because it's not possible to assess all users and all data connected to a topic or event. For example, depending on the API system that we use to collect data, we may access only a sample. Or because it is difficult to process all users and respective data. Some methods of data analytics may be difficult to process efficiently with huge data sets. Or eventually, the purpose of the study is not much demanding in terms of precision and accuracy, as it is the case of exploratory studies, and the sample is enough for our objectives. So, how can we get a sample of Twitter users? This figure is the typical sampling plan adopted in surveys, and it can be transposed to the Twitterverse. Despite the linear sequence the scheme suggests, it is not uncommon a change in the order of the stages, and in some cases, two stages can be designed and implemented simultaneously because there are decisions that are strongly interrelated. For example, the choice of the sampling frame and the sampling methods. There is limited work on how to design and execute a sampling plan to obtain samples from Twitter with the desirable properties of representation and replication. Therefore, I conducted a systematic literature review with a sample of social science papers to collect empirical evidence of sampling strategies on the Twitterverse. What I'm going to present now are some of the preliminary results I have found. I will basically follow the stages of the sampling plan in this figure, not necessarily by the order presented. Just to give some previous information about the search I have made to identify a sample of papers, I have queried 8 databases, including some of the main databases for social sciences. As seen previously, several units can be observed in Twitter: the tweets, the accounts, the users. Only studies involving samples of Twitter users were the focus of the literature review I conducted. Therefore, the search term was very specific and was defined as sample of Twitter users. The searches covered any part of the paper, title, abstract, and full text. No time restrictions were set, but the papers are necessarily posterior to 2006, the year when Twitter was launched. I did not include books or book chapters or theses or dissertations. I only focused on papers published in peer-reviewed journals containing evidence of sampling strategies to select Twitter users. And of course, it was important that the full text of the paper was available because in most cases I had to read the full text or the methods or the methodological section of the paper to find the information that was relevant. By applying the mentioned search strategy, 167 papers were obtained. After removing duplicates and applying the inclusion-exclusion criteria, the final sample is of 70 papers. Most of these papers are published by corresponding authors in the United States, followed by United Kingdom, Hong Kong, Spain, and Japan, 4 papers each. Most of the corresponding authors are affiliated at universities, and the predominant areas or domains of the respective faculties, schools, departments are communication and information, information and computer science, and social and behavioral sciences. The graph in blue presents the year of publication of the reviewed papers. Despite the decrease in 2017, there seems to be an increased interest in Twitter as a resource for applied social science research. And regarding the main purpose of the selected studies, the graph in yellow, the higher frequency is on explanatory studies, followed by descriptive studies. So, how is the target population defined in these studies? In the reviewed studies, there are 18 papers that define the target population simply as the general population of Twitter users. In the remaining studies, the majority use sociodemographic characteristics to bound the population of Twitter users, being age and region, country, the most frequently used. Tweet object features such as keywords or hashtags in the text of the tweet, or user object features such as number of tweets, number of followers the user have, are found in 19 studies, and geo-object features that refers to the location where the tweet is posted is the least used. Only 3 studies define the population according to this kind of criteria. Which sampling frames exist and are used to represent the target population? Well, in a study whose target population is defined as Twitter users, the ideal sampling frame is a list of Twitter users, exhaustive, updated, and informative. These are the criteria that a good sampling frame must fulfill to represent the target population, and from which a sample of tweeters is selected. A study may require more than one sampling frame in cases where there are several stages in sample selection. The point is that Twitter lacks a public membership list or a central registry like a phone directory. These drawbacks make knowing the full population impossible, so creating a sampling frame to represent the general population of Twitter users is problematic. In the studies reviewed, it is evident the difficulty in building a sampling frame. Most of the studies were conducted without a sampling frame to support sample selection. In 12 studies, online panels representative of the general adult population of a country, owned by research companies, for example, YouGov, Qualtrics, were the source for obtaining the sample of Twitter users. In 3 studies, the research team was able to build a sampling frame customized to the target population of the study. Crowdsourcing services like Amazon Mechanical Turk or Yahoo crowdsourcing service were the source of the sample in 4 studies, and 3 studies adopted a procedure of randomly generating numbers. This is very similar to random digit dialing in phone surveys. A software system generates numbers at random, and the Twitter users whose IDs match the generated numbers are included in the sample. So in resume, the studies reviewed are in most cases conducted without a sampling frame to support sampling, or resort to sampling frames that are external sources of the Twitterverse, either panels of research companies or crowdsourcing platforms. The choice of a sampling strategy is strongly conditioned by the existence of a sampling frame. When a sampling frame exists, a random selection of the sample is possible. In case of inexistence of a sampling frame, the sample must be non-randomly selected. Based on the reviewed papers, several sampling strategies were identified, mainly differentiated for being sampling frame based or non-sampling frame based strategies. In studies where the sampling frame is a panel representative of the general adult population or a crowdsourcing platform, these lists are not fully representative of the Twitter population because these lists were not created for that purpose. So the researcher asks the company owning the panel or the crowdsourcing platform for a sample of Twitter users, but has no active role in sample selection. So despite the existence of a sampling frame, I believe this procedure does not yield a random sample of Twitter users. In studies with tailored sampling frames, for example, the list of followers of a specific Twitter account, this kind of list can be used to sample Twitter users, and eventually we may include all the Twitter users listed in the sampling frame, and in this case there is no selection, or we can random select some of the users from that list, and in that case we have a random sample, at least a random sample of Twitter users from the available list. Another strategy, this one eventually yielding a random sample of Twitter users, is when the sampling frame is obtained from random generated numbers. As I have said, the numbers generated are searched in the Stream API or the REST API to check the existence of the corresponding Twitter IDs, and the users whose IDs match the generated numbers and belong to the target population are a random sample of Twitter users. In the situations where no sampling frame is available, as I said, the sample is selected under non-random sampling procedures. Most of them common to what we know from surveys. In the reviewed studies, evidence was found for convenience sampling, a procedure in which the researcher selects those who are more convenient, soliciting cooperation to the researcher's followers was the most frequent form of convenience sampling, because in these studies, the researcher are Twitter users, have a Twitter account, so they can take advantage of that. For studies adopted purposive sampling, a procedure where Twitter users are chosen based on a set of conditions defined by the researcher of what is a representative sample. For instance, choose those who are regular users of the Twitter, because the researcher considers that those users are the ones capable of providing the information the researcher is looking for. Snowball sampling was found in 7 studies. This is an extension of convenience sampling. It uses a predefined list of Twitter users as starting points, often defined by the researcher, which is then extended through snowballing, often via Twitter-specific relations, such as following or retweeting. Retweeting the invitation for the study to the followers of an initial sample of Twitter users was the type of snowball sampling found in the reviewed papers. Finally, the most frequent sampling strategy is a sequential strategy that relies on the contents of the tweets to identify those Twitter users who posted messages related to the topic or event under study and are therefore relevant for the study. The Twitter users are pinpointed based on topic-related keywords or topical hashtags contained in the messages they posted during the limited time period. These tweets and tweeters may all be included in the sample, or a random sample can be selected if, by some constraints of the study, it is not efficient to include all the material the search retrieved, because this strategy can yield, at least in an initial stage, can yield a great number of tweets and Twitter users, and eventually not all that amount of information is relevant for us. Another stage in the sampling plan is the choice of a data collection method. Before presenting the outcomes of the systematic review, just a brief refresh of concepts that are relevant in this stage. The first is to distinguish between data and metadata. Data is simply the content that can provide a description or a measurement of a person, event, or topic, and metadata is data about data, describes and gives context to data itself. Then the differentiation between self-report data and observed data. Self-report data are data that comes from people responding to questions about themselves regarding a wide variety of issues. Much of social science knowledge is based on self-report data, such as answers to a survey questionnaire. And observed data that is recorded without people actively doing anything or noticing the record. For example, things people post to social media is an example of observed data. Then the difference between cross-sectional data and longitudinal data. Cross-sectional type of data collected by observing many subjects at one point or period of time, while longitudinal data is data collected sequentially for many subjects over time. And finally, distinguish single mode data collection strategies from mixed mode strategies that uses a combination of modes. There are two ways of applying mixed mode designs in parallel, meaning that different subjects we have different subjects with different modes of data collection at the same time, or sequentially, one mode after another, both different. So in the reviewed papers, all studies are cross-sectional, except for the 3 studies that adopted experimental designs with control and treatment groups. Most of the studies are cross-sectional. The data collection designs found in the reviewed papers can be described as one sample, one mode, different samples, one mode, or one sample, different modes for different parts of the study. The most frequent design is one sample, one mode. Data is collected from one single sample using a single mode of data collection. In 25 studies, Twitter data or metadata is gathered for one sample of Twitter users, resorting to an API system, while in 14 studies, data were collected using a self-report mode, namely surveys. Then we have a sequential design in which data are collected for one sample of Twitter users with different modes for different parts of the study. Specifically, 15 studies collected data for a sample of Twitter users by means of a survey questionnaire. And then in a second stage, the same sample is asked to volunteer their Twitter usernames for researcher access their Twitter data or metadata via an API system. There were 3 studies with scarce information about the data collection, impeding a good understanding of how data was collected. And what is important to note that despite the data that in most cases interest to applied social science researcher about the Twitterverse is the one that is posted in the platform, the fact is that there are studies in which that data is not enough, and it may be necessary to resort to other data sources to supplement and enrich the data gathered on the Twitterverse. The 20 studies that employed sequential designs of data collection are an evidence of this. Now, regarding the size of the samples, here we distinguish between the size of the samples in terms of number of Twitter users and in terms of number of tweets. Regarding samples of Twitter users in the reviewed papers, 21% used fewer than 200 participants, while 50% used samples between 200 and 2000 participants. The size of the sample is to a great extent connected to the data collection strategy, namely whether the strategy relies exclusively on observed data or is strongly determined by it. The cases when API system is the single mode, or when API systems come in first in sequential designs, or if the strategy relies mostly on self-report data. So if we split the analysis by type of data collection strategy, we see that sample sizes of the studies that employ self-report methods of data collection tend to be lower, 557 users in mean, than the sizes of the studies that use exclusively observed data methods. In 3 studies using observed data, the sample size was above 1 million users. So we can have big samples. When analyzing the size of the sample of tweets in the studies that rely on observed data, the mean number of tweets is near 22 million with very high variability. So these figures give us an idea that in studies of the Twitterverse, we have big data, yes, but we also have small data studies. And now my final remarks, beginning with the good things about Twitter. Twitter is a perfect digital socioscope, providing an unlimited amount of data and free access, making research conducted on Twitter a growing field of study. Different academic disciplines have explored Twitter in order to illuminate the potential of the elements and networks one can find inside the platform. The research conducted on Twitter is vast and has been applied to a variety of domains: the spread of diseases, political events, ideology of users, interaction in natural disasters, and even the prediction of elections or stock markets. Twitter allows a renewed look at old topics. However, using Twitter for social science research is not devoid of problems. The representativity issue, it is very difficult to make inferences to general publics for different reasons. First, Twitter has small usage compared to other platforms or news media. Twitter has around 400 million of active users worldwide. Nevertheless, the number of accounts is very limited compared to other platforms, and even less if we look at real active accounts, people that post regularly. Secondly, Twitter usage differs significantly across the world. In some countries, it is widely used, while in others, its use is marginal. These differences of usage and within different countries makes it very hard to take Twitter as a representative sample of general population. It is simply not big enough and not used enough. In addition, the digital divide raises concerns about generalizing any knowledge from online to offline populations. Twitter has its own socio-demographic characteristics. The Twitter population tends to be younger. Some studies point that Twitter users also tend to be better educated and more affluent than the general population. And this situation raises important questions about the potential for reproducing and even amplifying social stratification from Twitter to the general population. Another issue is that the Twitter data may not be enough for the research goals. Twitter data is mostly composed of events and usually provide very little or no information on the user that generated data. Twitter data does not have much demographic information, and in social science research, variables such as age, sex, income, education is crucial for multivariate analysis or subgroup comparisons. In the social science research perspective, Twitter data is case-rich because it can provide us big samples, but variable poor because it has few covariates. That is why the complementarity of other modes is in some studies crucial. Surveys is the best mode to collect data at an individual level and is the most used to supplement Twitter data in the social science research. In addition, there is the challenge of collecting tweets. Data gathering from Twitter requires a great deal of computational knowledge and computer programming. These are not areas of expertise of social scientists, although the technical skills of data process and handling can be learned and polished through training. A researcher with very little knowledge of data formats, data gathering, storage, retrieval might encounter difficulties working with projects of such nature. Of course, this limitation is likely to be overcome with multidisciplinary teams where researchers with engineering backgrounds work together with those with their social scientist or humanistic backgrounds. Analyzing big data from Twitter can be challenging. Usually data collected is raw and needs pre-processing to clean out the variables that are not useful for research purposes. The pre-process and first exploration of data generally define if data is suitable for the project or not. In the case of Twitter, spam tweets, bots for the following networks, special characters need to be filtered before an in-depth analysis. Although Twitter provides an excellent variety of APIs to gather data, researchers need to be aware of their specific limitations and how to address them. The REST API is useful for data sets of tweets containing no more than 7 days in the past, while the Stream API is useful for collecting big data sets of events during periods of time. Of course, if one would have access to the fire hose, the question of which one, the REST or the stream API, is the best is superfluous. However, as I have mentioned, access to the fire hose rarely occurs unless one counts with strong economic funding. And finally, there is the data validity issue. Twitter APIs retrieve samples of 1% of all tweets, and they say it is a random sample. However, Twitter does not provide technical details on how the selection is done. So the researcher simply accepts the data without being able to exercise any control over the collection. But this is a common problem of all sources of found data when compared to design data. In the letter, the researcher designs and implements in a tailored way the data collection process, while with found data, the researcher is only passively involved. So, not dismissing the good things about Twitter, I think there is a lot of work to do until we decide without hesitation that Twitter is suitable for social science research. And so I end my presentation. Thank you for your attention.